Okay, we're live on YouTube. I am going to mute myself and here if you need me. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording too because it makes this loud, obnoxious announcements. Rats. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording too because it makes this. There we go. We're good.
Good morning, everybody.
Zach.
Good morning.
Good morning, all.
Morning, Ken.
Morning, Ken. Good to see you. Let's give folks another couple minutes to file in here. I'm seeing that we've got a pretty decent haul of committee members. Thank you all for joining this early. Thank you for joining for this special edition of the Groundwater Advisory Committee. Let's give folks just another couple minutes. Well, Justin, I'm seeing at least 6 committee members online. We've got a couple others, I think, yet to join, but that's okay. Why don't we get rolling, call this meeting to order and do a couple of introductions. Maybe we can start with committee members. Just quickly, who you are, who you represent, where you're from. I'll start. I'm Zach Freed. I'm a hydrologist with the Nature Conservancy. I run our freshwater program across the state, calling in from Bend, and I'm the chair of the Groundwater Advisory Committee. Ken, you're next on my screen. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Ken Betts, I irrigator and rancher in Harney County.
Thank you. And Dick, and then Robin.
Hello, Dick Smith, the Cooper Mountain Critical Groundwater area and the Beaverton area, farmer, grouchy old man.
Good morning, Robin Cook, GSI Water Solutions. I'm a hydrogeologist here in Portland.
Thank you, Robin. Stephen, and then I'm not sure if we have Eric or Brandon here, but Stephen, why don't you go next?
Stephen Patton. I work for the City of Milton Freewater in the Public Works Department, representing municipal water users.
All right. Dave, how about you? I see Dave is on the call. Dave, if you could take yourself off mute, introduce yourself, appreciate it. We'll hit pause on Dave. In the meantime, the list of folks attending is growing a little bit. Other committee members that I missed, please feel free to come off mute and introduce yourself. I'll give you just a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds here. Otherwise, we'll move on to staff members. Okay, great. Sounds like I didn't miss anybody. Justin, are you paying better attention to our participant list in chat? Do you see anybody else on the committee who has joined?
I don't see anybody else, and I did see in my email that Brandon indicated he was going to be late, but he would be joining later on. So sends his apologies for being late, but he'll join us in a bit.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Why don't you get us started with department staff introductions?
Okay, good morning. I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section, and I guess I facilitate convening of the Groundwater Advisory Committee.
Ivan.
Good morning, everybody. Ivan Gall, Director for the Water Resources Department here in Salem.
Hey, Ivan, good to see you.
Good morning, Annette Liba, Technical Services Division Administrator. I will pass it to Tim.
Thanks, Annette. I'm Tim Seymour. I'm the Assistant Manager for the Groundwater section.
Jason.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Spreet. I'm the East Region Manager for Water Resources out of Baker City.
Hi, I'm Laura Hart, Water Policy Analyst and another Rules Coordinator.
Excellent. Thank you all. Appreciate you introducing yourselves. Justin, let's quickly go over the agenda. I'm going to offer a quick reminder about why we are having this special extra credit edition of the Groundwater Advisory Committee. Really briefly, on our September 9th call, on our September 9th quarterly meeting, this committee held or heard a presentation from Jason and Laura and about voluntary agreements. We heard public comment during that committee meeting, and the public comment spurred this committee to have a unanimous motion to have an additional meeting, that is today, to just discuss the department's guidance for voluntary agreements a little bit more carefully, provide a little bit more time for us, this committee, to hear from the public about the voluntary agreement guidance, and put us in a better position as a committee to have informed opinions and recommendations to the department about voluntary agreements in general. Justin, what would you add before I briefly talk about the agenda?
I think you stated it well. we've just got a one topic agenda item. I just put the agenda in the chat to make sure that folks had access to it, though I suspect you do because that's where the link was to the meeting. I will also say that in that agenda is a link to the current draft of the voluntary agreement guidance. That's the topic and what we're talking about. And yeah, that's the scope of what we're taking public comment on. So.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. That scope comment is a relevant one, just like last time this committee discussed this topic. Want to be clear that public comment period is closed for the closely related Harney Basin groundwater rules. So we are not talking about those rules today. We are solely restricting our committee discussion to voluntary agreements. Closely related topic, I get it, but I trust y'all to walk that line appropriately. So we're going to have a presentation from Jason and Tim. Thank you, Jason and Tim, for joining us. I appreciate in advance the work you put into the presentation today. We are going to do things a little bit differently today. Usually this committee holds public comment at the very end of our debate or our discussion. In this case today, we are having public comment right in the middle, right between the presentation from the department and the committee's discussion about voluntary agreements. The intent for that, of course, is to make sure that public comments can be provided to the committee before the committee talks about what we think and what we see, what questions we have. So when we go up next, we're going to have the presentation, and we will have an opportunity for the committee to ask clarifying questions of Tim and Jason after that presentation. But I'd ask committee members if you have like a substantive comment or suggestion or feedback, hold that for the actual committee discussion agenda item at 10 o'clock. But unless there are any other questions or comments from staff or committee members, I'll hold for a couple of seconds here.
Maybe one thing to help us facilitate the public comment, since we've got a number of folks here, if you would like to make a public comment, could you please note that in the chat during the first part when the department's given a overview of the draft rules, and then we can see how many folks are interested, at least initially, and we can see kind of how we manage our time in the next agenda item. So thank you very much.
Great idea, Justin. Thank you already, Rob and Ken, and anybody else who is providing their comment today. With that, Jason, Tim, I will turn it over to you to give this committee an update on things that have changed since we saw the last draft of the voluntary agreement guidance.
All right. Thank you, Chair Freed, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today on this. I'll share my screen real quick, hopefully. All right, hopefully folks can see that. Right on, okay. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the updates that have been made based on comments from the September GWAC committee meeting, as well as comments we received at the September Water Resources Commission meeting. So we made a few changes to the document. We'll go over a little bit of those, the history again of the document, and then we will talk about the current status, and then eventually we'll get to the discussion. But just a few slides here real quick. So a little bit of background real quick as a reminder, guidance development. So from July through October of 2024, we had some focus group meetings to start the development of some guidance, and those meetings had a number of folks from the community on them. They were held either virtually or at High Desert Partnership office, and we discussed different aspects of this guidance and what voluntary agreements, kind of the background of voluntary agreements and the statutory requirements. And then in October of 24, we brought the first draft of the voluntary agreement guidance to the Rules Advisory Committee meeting for 5/12. Then September, we shared the draft guidance with our commission. September of this year with our commission. And then again, as I mentioned with this committee here, we received some public comments at both of those meetings. And then as Zach mentioned, the GWAC was interested in further review and input, and that's why we're here today. And then in October, just this month, we updated that document. We tailored it to the Harney Basin. We made a few other changes. We tailored it to the Harney Basin because that is where the interest is at this point, and we wanted to give the opportunity to focus on the Harney right now. So some of the modifications we made to the document based on comments and GWAC recommendations was we focused that language on the Harney Basin as being the area where the most interest is at this point. We clarified some assumptions related to prior appropriation, how we're going to regulate folks that are outside of voluntary agreements, and how those two groups of folks that are participating in voluntary agreements versus those that aren't are going to be either regulated or in some cases not regulated if they're in a voluntary agreement. And then we modified the language to clarify how we would evaluate success. We removed that minimum participation level of 30%. If you all recall, we had a minimum participation level. We got a number of comments on that, so we just completely removed that participation level language. And then we simplified the language around qualification for the voluntary agreement. We have language in there that specified a range of years that participants needed to irrigate. We removed that and just said, as long as you're not subject to forfeiture, you can participate in a voluntary agreement. So once again, as I mentioned before, this draft guidance is interim guidance. It's subject to any future revisions. We get comments today or in the future that can impact the language in the voluntary agreement. So it is just an interim document. It's intended to aid groundwater users in understanding the minimum requirements according to the department to receive a positive recommendation to the commission. So that doesn't mean that people can't come up with ideas that the department has not in this document. And, upon evaluation, we very well may recommend adoption to the commission for any voluntary agreement. So this is just an aid, help folks kind of understand what the department feels is necessary in an agreement. It's also intended to aid the commission in its evaluation of the agreement before any recommendation is made. So what we will do is we'll take the voluntary agreement, make an evaluation of that, make a recommendation of the commission. The commission can refer back to this document in its evaluation as well. And I'll mention here too, it is our intent to bring any submitted voluntary agreement to this committee as well for review and offer evaluation to this committee from the department as well for its recommendation. So the current status of voluntary agreements, this backs up a little bit to June 2025. We were provided from groundwater users a template, or from a contractor that was working with groundwater users, gave us a template resembling rotation agreements. The contractor received some information on rotations from the department and then developed a basic template based on that language. There are areas of potential non-alignment with department guidance noted in that template, but once again, this is just guidance. And then in July, we heard that there was between 2 and 4 voluntary agreements in development among different users in the basin. And then in November of 2025, we plan to, we've been tentatively asked to have a couple of staff members come down to the basin and listen to folks as they can present information on their voluntary agreements to department staff. So my intent is to have myself, the water master, Dally Swindlehurst, down there, and hopefully if Tim is available, he can attend as well. And we'll go down and just listen to and answer any questions folks have, or just listen to what they have to say about their voluntary agreements and how development is occurring down there. And then in December 2025, as I mentioned, the 2 to 4 voluntary agreements in development could be presented to the commission for consideration and request adoption in lieu of Division 512 rules. So with that, Zach or Justin, I'll turn it back over to you for discussion with the committee.
Thanks, Jason. Really do appreciate that overview. Excuse me. At this time, we're not going to go straight into GWAC discussion, but I do want to open the floor for committee members to ask any clarifying questions about anything that Jason just mentioned to us. So if you've got clarifying questions about the scope, the intent, the use of this guidance, now is the time to ask them. But if you've got opinions or strong feelings about what should or should not be in there, please hold those to the appropriate agenda item. So clarifying questions for Jason or Tim? I will start off by offering one clarifying question, Jason. I understand that one of the developments you mentioned was focusing the language of the guidance on the Harney Basin in particular. That is understandable given the context of the VAs currently in development in the Harney Basin. But of course, as we all know, voluntary agreements are a tool across Oregon. So does the department eventually intend to have guidance that's more broad than the Harney Basin? Or do you intend to adapt this guidance or develop new guidance for voluntary agreements outside of the Harney Basin?
That is the intent to do that, and as we move forward into the future, that's an option for the department, and I believe that is the intent, is to develop statewide guidance, and likely that would lead to a statewide rulemaking on voluntary agreement.
Okay, got it. Statewide rulemaking on voluntary agreements. Okay, thank you. But totally understand that in the meantime, guidance is needed for the commission and for voluntary agreements relevant to the Harney Basin. So that's why the focus and the scope is on the Harney Basin.
Right.
Thank you. Other committee members, questions? Not hearing any. I think we will make extra room for public comment. I see at least one commenter, Larissa, has a time sensitivity. Harmony indicated there may be others as well. So what I'd like to do, please, again, as Justin requested, if you would like to provide public comment, please go ahead and indicate that during chat or in the chat right now. We are starting a little bit early on our agenda for public comment, so I do want to make sure that if folks are joining specifically to provide that comment at 9:30, we have time for them as well. But let's start off in the order that we received it. Public commenters, as you know, please standing request, focus your comments on the voluntary agreement guidance. The committee would appreciate any feedback or thoughts you have about what this guidance, what it does, what it doesn't do, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. In order, we had Commissioner Frank as the first public commenter, Ken Beerley as the second one, Harmony as the third. Then we'll go over to Larissa and Rachel. And that's where we'll start for now. So Commissioner Frank, go ahead.
Thanks, Zach. Rob Frank, Harney County Commissioner. Really, the only thing that I wanted to comment on at this time was I had concern over under the section that says authority. It says that the commission can delegate its authority to approve or reject voluntary agreements, including the amendments to the department. It can give that authority away. But then all the language in the rest of the guidance document specifically names the commission as the authority to approve or reject, and ORS 537.745 explicitly obligates that authority to the commission. And so to me, I would prefer to not see that authority delegated away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Appreciate that. Yeah, it'd be interesting to discuss that a little bit further during our committee discussion item. Thank you. Ken Beerley, over to you.
I'd like to defer to Larissa so she could make sure that she doesn't get late to whatever she has to do.
Great idea. Thank you, Ken. Larissa, are you available? Are you ready now?
Okay, there. I think I got unmuted. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, for letting me go. My name is Larissa Singhose. I'm a farmer and rancher in Riley. I would just like to say that the groundwater users of the Harney Basin have not got the opportunity to provide a lot of comment and feedback on the voluntary guidance. And I would hope that the advisory committee would recommend the department not to finalize this guidance until they have worked with the locals to get the support to meet the goals. I'm in looking at this, I see that the department wants to use an unproven model to advise on a legal matter that requires substantial evidence. Please consider that a model, especially an unproven model, is not substantial evidence and should never be a substitute for a legal statute that requires actual data to back it up. I feel that a voluntary agreement that is backed by legal and technical basis should be allowed without more regulations and control from the department on how the voluntary agreement is designed. The proposed voluntary guidance would allow the department to terminate a voluntary agreement without substantial evidence. The department could advise a determination of a voluntary agreement without water users' regard or any evidence to back it up. And understand that these voluntary agreements, because they've never been done, the water users of Harney Basin that are developing them are doing these at their own expense to hire legal professionals and other professionals to help make sure that these are legal and can be backed by technical data. So it is an expense that would be a shame to be just whisked away at the whim of the department. So please, I would recommend that the water users have an opportunity to help develop the guidance for these voluntary agreements. Thank you very much for this opportunity to provide comments.
Thank you, Larissa. Appreciate your comments. Great. Let's move on to Ken Beerley. Ken, are you ready now?
I am.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the proposed guidance. I've worked with voluntary groups for more than 2 decades, and while what I've observed is that there's unlimited creativity among people with a desire to accomplish a goal. The importance of choosing your own goal, in my opinion, is critical for any voluntary action. I provided comments to the Water Resources Commission in September with suggestions, and that Justin and Zach have kindly shared that with the advisory committee. But it appears that the department disagrees with my suggestions, and I believe that my concerns about the guidance remain valid. If adopted in the current form, the commission will not likely be bothered by considering further any voluntary agreements. The guidance, in my opinion, remains an artifice of voluntary approach hidden in the sheep's clothing of a regulatory requirement with the department in control. The requirement of a target voluntary reduction is both an oxymoron and the wolf in sheep's clothing. The construct makes any voluntary action subservient to the department's determination. So there's a good reason that voluntary agreements have not been considered in the past 48 years. That's because until recently, OWRD gave out groundwater permits like Halloween candy. And coupled with the common understanding of use it or lose it, it's understandable that no one has considered voluntarily reducing groundwater use. Only in the past 5 years has any systematic consideration of limiting groundwater and evaluating groundwater at a statewide level been considered. The 2021 evaluation of groundwater conditions made a major change in in the community's understanding. Perhaps the department was aware of this much previously, but it made publicly available the information about the limitations of groundwater. And the change in permitting standards last year has radically changed the consideration of using groundwater in areas with limited surface water. And only after these actions is there really an incentive to develop voluntary agreements. So in my opinion, for voluntary agreements to be effective, groundwater users need to have the opportunity to identify who will participate, who the cooperative players will be, and to determine the reductions that they can provide. It is assumed that Water Resources Department will provide technical assistance. As Jason said earlier, that's what they're proposing to do in November. But it's also necessary that the role of the agency be in the form of technical assistance, not hidden regulatory guidance. And that's the real rub that I see here. If you wish to make the proposed guidance truly useful to encourage, promote, and recognize voluntary agreements as stated in the statute, you need to respect the ability and creativity of groundwater users, not tie them to some previous Water Resources Department determination. The proposed rules have taken the concept of voluntary groundwater management, made it into an OWRD program by tying target voluntary reductions to an OWRD determination. The proposed guidance simply becomes another way for Water Resources Department to set PTW without declaring a critical groundwater area. For the Harney Basin, this results in irrigators and others with no or very limited decision space, other than to find ways to satisfy what the department determines. That's not really an incentive. The guidance presumes that the RAC proposal will be adopted and that before any voluntary agreement is considered by the language of it. In my opinion, you could eliminate the term and concept of target voluntary reduction altogether and rely on agreed water use limits from the October draft that would clearly set voluntary as a voluntary approach. For groundwater areas outside of official designation of critical groundwater areas, the goal should be to avoid conditions that lead to declined excessively or excessive declining, rather than some prior determined groundwater level. While irrigators may not have the hydrologic model to determine those conditions, they can develop an understanding of their circumstances in cooperation with the department and propose reduction targets and schedules that they can economically and ecologically achieve. I predict that under the proposed guidance, it'll be another 4 or 5 decades before any group of irrigators or groundwater users proposes a voluntary agreement. I think that we're on a good track. I think we need to think for the entire state, because it's very clear we're wrestling with declining resources available. We need to find ways to encourage people to reduce rather than force them to reduce. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate your comment as well as your submitted written comments that, as you indicated, we shared with the committee. I want to note we're about halfway through. Thank you, Eric. We're about halfway through the people who have currently indicated they want to provide public comment. We have already heard on a wide range of different topics. I want to quickly check in, especially before Larissa has to leave, and see if the committee members have any clarifying questions for the public commenters. Okay, thanks for indulging me. Just wanted to, since we're hearing about a lot of different topics, I wanted to check in and make sure that there was an opportunity for committee members to ask clarifying questions before we got too deep into it. But thank you, appreciate it, Ken. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Rob. Let's move on. Harmony and then Rachel and then Eric are up next. Harmony, you may have indicated that there are other people who would like to provide comment as well. Can you, before you provide your public comment, can you kind of clarify that? Or who else should we be looking to in the chat today?
Yeah, I wasn't sure like what the timing of comments would be, which is why I'm still at a coffee shop instead of at home. Yeah, Larissa had to leave early, so I'm glad. Thanks for letting her comment. And then people might be popping in. I mean, people have jobs and taking care of kids, and they're doing the best they can to follow along with this process and engage as they're able, you know, along with everything else that goes on with life. So thanks. I saw Eric chime in and he's going to comment, but I'm not sure who else will pop on. And, you know, most of these folks are not professional meeting goers like me. And so I appreciate your willingness to accommodate their ability to participate. We might get a couple other people popping in. Hi, everyone. Chair Freed, members of the committee. My name is Harmony Burright. I am here to provide comments on the voluntary agreement guidance. Just a little bit of context back on my background. So I've got 20 years of experience in integrated water management, public participation, conflict resolution. My undergraduate and graduate research was in collective action for water management. So what are the kind of factors affecting how and when and why people come together to collectively manage water? My research follows Eleanor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who actually set out to kind of find empirical evidence discrediting Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons, which is an oft-cited theory about natural resource management. And she actually found a lot of really strong empirical evidence showing that people work together to manage the resource, and that you know, state interventions can be important, as well as market interventions. Those can also result in failure as well. So we really need to be thinking about, you know, kind of all this whole suite of tools for effective management. I really want to comment today primarily on process. So last we saw you, GWAC, you were hearing some pretty impassioned pleas from the folks who are going to be impacted by the decisions regarding groundwater management in the Harney Basin, including the voluntary agreements. And you were hearing from folks that felt that their voices were not being heard in this process, and concerned that they would not be heard. I did not see this GWAC meeting online. I've been trying to follow your process just so that I can help others be informed and involved. It's still not online. I learned about it on Wednesday afternoon, less than a week in advance, and didn't really have time, as much time as I would like to, because I have a kid who is out of school and family in town. And so, and I'm paid, you know, I do this stuff for a living. So it was really hard for me to participate in your process. And I hope that there's a little bit more advance notice in the future, and that you do post this information online so that people can follow along. I have been supporting the work on voluntary agreements in the Harney Basin since late last year. There was some modest funding to kind of support the initial work, and now I am currently working in a pro bono or volunteer capacity. And so I'm not paid to make these comments. No one is paying me. I'm doing this because I believe it's the right thing to do. And I really want to see momentum maintained in the Harney Basin on voluntary agreements, because I do believe that of all the places in Oregon, the opportunity is ripe for these to come forward in the Harney Basin. I have submitted pretty extensive public comments, primarily on process. I I do just want to note that it wasn't until April or May of this year that groundwater users, the affected groundwater users in this community, were even organized. So meetings of these groundwater users didn't start occurring until May of 2025. And so they're really doing their best to come up to speed on a lot of information on policy, on science, on process. They didn't know that the Groundwater Advisory Committee existed until probably 2 months ago. They didn't even know that the Water Resources Commission existed until about a couple months ago. And they're really trying to make sense of, you know, all of these systems and information in place that will fundamentally affect the course of their lives. It will affect, you know, how they make a living, where they live, how they support their families. These are really, really big decisions. And I hope that we can all take the care required to be really considerate of the impacts on people's lives. So what I would recommend to the GWAC is, you know, you have not heard from groundwater users. You have not heard from the folks supporting groundwater users. And I would really encourage a more kind of balanced discussion here on the guidance. You know, most of the groundwater users that I've been working to organize and engage in these processes, they have not had the opportunity to review the guidance, provide comments. They're still struggling to just figure out what it means. Most of them didn't even know voluntary agreements were a thing until May of 2025. So we're working hard to get them up to speed. And I would just really encourage us not to rush to anything right now, and really encourage that we sit down and have dialogue with those who are going to be affected by this. They are, you know, counter to some of the rhetoric that I'm seeing in, you know, in the press and in meetings. Like, these are really, really thoughtful people who care very, very deeply about the resource. They care very, very deeply about their neighbors, about their community. They're just asking to have a voice in this process. And I really think that that is a reasonable request for something that is going to fundamentally transform their community and their lives. So thank you so much for taking the time to hear from me today. I do hope that you'll take a look at the comments that I submitted. Brevity is not my strength. I'm so sorry. I didn't have that much time to assemble comments, so I just kind of just started writing, and there you go. And I'm happy to take any comments. I would love to have the opportunity to bring groundwater users before you for a presentation, potentially at a future meeting if you so desire and request it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harmony. I really do appreciate the perspective you bring. Thank you for the written comments you submitted. We got those before the meeting yesterday, so thank you again for that. I will move us along through the next two public commenters, then I'll pause again, see if there's any clarifying comments by the committee members for the public commenters. Next up, we have Rachel O'Connor. Rachel, please go ahead, introduce yourself, provide your comment.
Hi, good morning, all. I am Rachel O'Connor. I work with the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm based in Portland. Just a little bit of background regarding our work with voluntary agreements. EDF is really supportive of voluntary agreements. In 2022, we collaborated with the Harney Place-Based Planning Collaborative to develop a report that looked at Oregon statute regarding voluntary agreements and tried to provide some guidance around what the important considerations would be for implementing an effective voluntary agreement, and also provided some examples of similar type approaches in other geographies. Overall, we think that this approach can be extremely helpful in places where groundwater use reductions are necessary, and the community would like to avoid a strictly regulatory approach. I really appreciate the department's guidance on voluntary agreements. I think that is extremely necessary because the statute is very vague. I also think that a rulemaking process would be invaluable. I do think that there's some places within the guidance where language could be strengthened to make sure that the outcome of voluntary agreements are better aligned with the 695-12 rules, or whatever rules are moved forward to reduce or stop groundwater declines. So I'd like to see a little bit of language that ties the outcome together, though acknowledging that the process to get to that outcome would be very different in a regulatory approach versus a voluntary approach. I also do have some concerns about the reporting and monitoring section, and just thinking about that, because this is the first voluntary agreement that would be, or set of voluntary agreements that would be administered in the state. There is going, I think, to be a need to be very adaptive and making sure that the voluntary agreement is having the effect that it is intended to have. And I worry about finding out that perhaps irrigators don't need to reduce their water use as much, or need to reduce water use more in order to align with what the ultimate management objectives are for the basin. And I do worry about what the burden might be on the department to support that monitoring and be able to then enable any adapting as a result of any monitoring. So I just would like consideration around what the resource needs might be in order to make sure that we have a good understanding of the efficacy of the voluntary agreement, and then that is really adequately communicated with those who are participating, and that there's a really strong kind of responsiveness between the department and the participants of the agreement. But overall, just really appreciate the guidance and the conversation that's put out, and support the other comments about making sure that groundwater users in the basin are aware and have a lot of opportunity to also provide their own comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Appreciate your comments. Eric, you are up next, and just before you start talking, Eric, I'm going to check one more time. Is there anybody else on this call who would like to provide public comment? If so, please indicate that in chat. But Eric, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for listening to my comments. After reading through the draft, it seems like a regulation enforcing 512 rules for Harney Basin versus a voluntary agreement for the Oregonians and the water users of the state. It doesn't feel like there's a freedom for proposing a solution that includes the technical data and facts that are needed for a voluntary agreement that would benefit all users in the area that are agreeing, and the state and the department's projected objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate your feedback. Committee members, if you have any clarifying questions for Harmony, Rachel, or Eric, please feel free to speak up. I've got one clarifying question. I think this is for Harmony. If you're still around, thank you again for joining from the coffee shop. Harmony, I hear you that there may need to be more, you would like to have more public process and interaction with the community and potential parties to a voluntary agreement about the guidance itself. And I appreciate that. We heard from a couple of different public commenters that increased public engagement is going to be valuable. I feel like that's in tension with the proposed timeline to bring voluntary agreements from the community before the commission in December. Harmony, can you tell us a little bit more about what you envision for that level of engagement between this committee and groundwater users in the basin, and what timeline that might occur on?
Yeah, definitely. So there's some kind of factors at play here. First, we've never done this before as a state. So there are challenges associated with that and opportunities associated with that. there is a real sense of urgency from groundwater users who are, you know, seeing proposed regulatory reductions and are feeling kind of surprised by that proposal, and don't feel that it aligns with their observations, their experiences, their concerns, or what they've previously heard from the department. And so there's like, we just kind of, frankly, like, it's just, we're kind of in a weird spot where groundwater users are feeling a sense of urgency to kind of pull this together in order to demonstrate clearly their commitment to action. And, you know, how this all fits with, you know, with rules, like, I don't know, if someone who gets paid more money than me, because I'm, you know, not getting paid for this, hopefully is figuring that out. I would say though that I still remain very excited about the opportunity for voluntary agreements in Oregon. And I do think where there is alignment between groundwater users and the department, we're most likely to have success, long-term success in the basin. And success to me looks like people working together to solve a problem. Success to me looks like people trusting each other. It looks like groundwater users openly and willingly sharing information and data with the department because they see that they're collectively trying to manage the resource versus they have a fear that that information is going to be used against them. And really right now, like, in terms of trust and relationships, I think we're kind of reaching a breaking point, frankly. And I hope that we as a state can continue to kind of foster trust and build positive working relationships amongst all groundwater users, environmental and non, you know, and irrigators. But everything kind of feels like it's coming to a head right now. And I remain hopeful, but we'll see. I think as we're trying to pull this together, I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of blow our role to make sure we get the right decision for everybody. But a lot of that's going to come down to just, you know, things that I don't ultimately have control over.
Understood. Thank you, Harmony. I appreciate your perspective on that. Once we get to the committee discussion portion of the agenda, I'll be curious to hear what other committee members think about having some potential parties to a potential voluntary agreement come before the committee and provide a presentation. One last question for Rachel. Rachel, you had mentioned that you'd like to see language that ties voluntary agreements together better with potential basin rules and their outcomes. I'm curious about the outcomes. Are you thinking there about the permissible total withdrawal outcomes, as in the reductions to pumping, or are you thinking about the target annual water level trend outcomes, as in the stability of the aquifer?
That's a great question. I actually don't have specificity around that. Candidly, I initially was thinking PTWs until you mentioned otherwise. I want to think about that a little bit more. I also was also thinking about the time scale in which the basin rules are set for, and wanting the voluntary agreements to be aligned with those.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. Committee members, any other questions for our last three public commenters or our first three public commenters? Okay, great. In that case, you know, technically the public comment period on the agenda is through 10 a.m. In case anybody else joins and wants to provide public comment, I want to maintain that opportunity for the next 9 minutes, but I think otherwise, until we see any evidence of that, I think we should move on towards committee discussion. Justin, does that sound right to you? Do you have any suggestions or concerns about that approach?
No, I think that sounds reasonable to me. And I just looking down the list of attendees, I see that Brandon's been able to join. So just note that we have him as well as a committee member. Oh,
Yeah.
I also see Ken barely raising his hand. So maybe there's more.
Great. Well, we are still within the public comment period. So first off, Brandon, welcome. Thanks for joining. Brandon, I'll ask you to introduce yourself maybe before our next agenda item when we get to the committee discussion. But for now, Ken, you have your hand raised. You look like you're ready to provide additional feedback to the committee. Go ahead.
Actually, one of the things that you asked Harmony was about the timing. And as I see it, the forcing function on this discussion is the timing for adoption of the 512 rules, which is forcing people to make decisions. And the arbitrary determination that December will be the time in which those rules will be adopted has forced a lot of focused effort without a whole lot of guidance. So I think that's why the crunch is here and why there is basically no or little limited flex on what the roles of can be in terms of voluntary agreements as well as the discussion about alternative ways. Anyway, that's just my opinion, but I will expound on it. Thank you.
Of course, thank you. Okay, well, I'll briefly reiterate the call. If other people in chat would like to provide public comment, feel free to let us know. But in the meantime, I'd like to move us along to committee discussion about the draft guidance. We've heard quite a bit. We've heard from Jason about the changes that have been made to the most recent draft guidance. We've also heard from public commenters a wide range of feedback around everything from the authority within the guidance, like who owns that? Is that the commission? Is it something that can be delegated? All the way over to trying to align or not align the Harney Basin specific guidance with potential Harney Basin specific rules. I'd like to kick us off with just general discussion and open space for comments, thoughts, or questions. But then I do have a couple of prompts or nudges for the committee if folks are feeling quiet and uncaffeinated this morning. So I'll shut up for once, and other committee members, please feel free to chime in. This is open space.
I had just a couple things. This is Robin. So the second paragraph on page 2, I don't know if it worked. Should I share my screen? We can just talk about it. I just had a couple of questions about the goals of it and how to decide whether or not these voluntary agreements are working. The first one is that the agreement should be to reduce use such that groundwater levels are stabilized. And I'm wondering which definition of stabilized we would be going with, whether it's the 0% change or if it's the stable groundwater levels that are defined under 008. So just some questions about the water level stabilization criteria. And then I guess my concern is a little bit about, trying to make some progress with these voluntary agreements. The rest of the paragraph goes on to say, if you're on track with the trajectory outlined in the rules, then you're good. But if you're not, then then the voluntary agreement is considered unsuccessful. And I guess I would just hope that some progress is better than no progress with the voluntary agreements, and maybe it shouldn't be quite so black and white and have some range around the amount of groundwater stabilization that's occurring. Just a thought.
Yeah, I like that, Robin. We're not supposed to talk about the proposed rules, but I hear that adjacent to the proposed rules, there are conversations about adaptive management frameworks in the Harney Basin. I wonder if there's a sort of, instead of simply stating, oh, this voluntary agreement is not on track, on trajectory, therefore it's out of compliance with the voluntary agreement itself. I wonder if there should be a chance to to course correct to before it's determined to be not in compliance. I'm curious about that though, like how would you operationalize that, Robin, especially if the department has multiple voluntary agreements that they're trying to wrangle at the same time?
Right. I mean, maybe it's rather than are you meeting this one particular metric or with you within a band, a plus minus of the goal. I don't know. It just seems like maybe there should be a little flexibility in there before they decide that the agreement's not working.
I like that. Something to workshop for sure. I would like to hear other committee members on that thoughts on that idea of trying to adaptively manage the trajectory for voluntary agreements. But before we do, Justin, Jason, Tim, department staff, to Robin's first question, what is the definition of the stabilized goal?
Well, I'll jump in there and I'll ask Tim to jump in as well. But as it says in the guidance, the stabilized goal, needs to align for the same success metrics as the proposed Division 512 rules. So that would be, essentially zero decline. I mean, obviously that can be dynamically stable, but we want to get to a place where we can say that groundwater levels are no longer declining.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the stabilization, we're likely to lean on whatever is adopted by the commission and rule, as that is what the commission has determined should be the goal for the basin. And so that is what we lean on there. I think we left it specifically vague. It did not define stabilization because that really is a policy choice of the commission. Whether they're going to allow or whether they're going to set the goal as a target water level trend of no decline over a 6-year period as we have proposed in rule, or if they're going to choose some other value that they have the opportunity to choose.
Got it. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Appreciate it, Jason. And yeah, I'd seen Rob's chat. We're all trying to balance this line of not talking about the Division 512 rules with talking about this closely related topic. Appreciate y'all and your continued grace as we navigate that boundary. Robin had some other thoughts about the trajectory and trying to add a band of uncertainty to allow for variations in the trajectory of voluntary agreements versus the any proposed basin rules. Committee members, do you have any additional ideas or thoughts along those lines about how to operationalize that? What that actually looks like in practice?
This is Stephen. I don't have any specifics on it, but I do think the ability for voluntary agreements to adapt and realize, to kind of level in on to that long-term target would be a valuable addition. So that way they can, based on the ground results, be able to adapt and give them a time frame to allow them to correct, whether that's above or below, to meet that long-term threshold.
Thanks, Stephen. That makes good sense to me, I think. I think part of the continued discussion is by necessity, it's hypothetical because we're not sure what voluntary agreements will look like and how many there will be, but I think it's going to be a tricky, I'm concerned about implementation. I'm concerned about how the department staff are going to be able to effectively track multiple ongoing voluntary agreements in conjunction with their existing duties, tracking progress towards proposed basin rules, whatever basin rules end up going into effect. So I continue to be interested in how this actually looks on the ground. More praxis than theory, I guess. But thank you for that discussion. Any other thoughts from the committee about the guidance being proposed? Yeah, Dick, go ahead.
Well, I had in mind that perhaps 5-year increments for review of progress or failure or adjustment might be a good timeline to be able to adjust, because I'm sure adjustments are going to be required.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I see in the draft guidance, and Jason or Tim, feel free to chime in if I'm getting this wrong, but I'm seeing that the voluntary agreements will have their own, maybe they will be reviewed during adaptive management checkpoints outlined in proposed basin rules. Is that accurate? Am I reading that wrong?
Yeah, so our thought, Zach, there was to tie the adaptation in the proposed rules and the voluntary agreements together as we try to move towards success. So stepping back just a little bit to try to like lay out my thought process here, and the thought process that we've gone through as we've rewritten some of these rules is that if the commission adopts proposed rules and they set out these trajectories to achieve success, essentially what they're saying is this is the amount of water level decline we're going to allow as we stabilize. And so the hope would be that voluntary agreements could also follow that same path and not allow any additional decline beyond that. And so as we move towards success, we want to be checking in regularly so that we can adapt, so that we either don't over curtail or don't under curtail, so that we don't cause more economic pain than necessary, and we don't cause more impacts to springs, streams, domestic wells, etc. And so by tying the two together, there's regular check-ins. So over the course of 6 years, the department will have to check in with the commission at least twice, once at 3 years and once at 6 years, to review the success of the program and the effects of the rules. And we'll be able to see where are we at from a water level trend standpoint, and then make adjustments either up or down. The benefit of voluntary agreements is that voluntary agreements could adjust on a year-to-year basis. With the regulatory approach that was laid out, you only adjust every 6. And so a voluntary agreement could actually be more adaptive than this process. And then the last thing I would say is we're looking at a median groundwater level change across fairly broad areas. A couple of these sub areas are small, Dog Mountain, Weaver Springs, but over the Silver Creek, the Sylvies, Blitzen Voltage, those are pretty large areas. And so looking at a median is a fairly, or it's a less responsive metric. So swings by outliers are not going to impact that in the same way that overall changes in the system will. And so we're really trying to dial that in on a representative metric. And so our hope was that by laying out that path to success, voluntary agreements could be very creative in how they propose reductions that get them that stabilize water levels. And we tried to pull out all the language that tied the goal to pumpage reductions, like a specific quantity of pumpage reductions, and instead tried to tie it back to that measure of success and that trajectory and that path to get to success. So did that help answer your question there?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. And Dick, when you're thinking about 5-year periods, sounds like the actual check-in period might be more frequent. If it's tied, we don't know what the proposed rules are that will be approved by the commission, but the check-in periods with voluntary agreements are going to be tied to adaptive management checkpoints in the proposed rules. So how does every 3 years sound to you, Dick?
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
it was just that I didn't see any hard and fast check-in rules with the with the proposed amendment. And I pulled 5 years just out of the sky, but oftener is good. No, that's fine. I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of the amendment overall. I would like to see an addition to it where the irrigators have a small amount of skin in the game in regard to domestic wells. I would like to see them, the 670 irrigators, all put up a small amount, perhaps $100, $200, to create a fund to make whole any exempt wells that they pump dry.
Thanks, Dick. I appreciate that. Yeah, good feedback on the overall amendment, but your greater tension that you were mentioning of the specificity in the revised draft proposed guidance on voluntary agreements versus like how specific it is versus how flexible and adjustable it is. That was one of my kind of overall nudges for this committee to discuss, because trying to understand how prescriptive this guidance should be, how specific about what the check-in periods are, for example, versus how kind of adaptable it is, how flexible it is for potential voluntary agreement parties. That's an important tension to navigate, especially for the department to provide this guidance to the commission. And so I'd be curious if there are other thoughts about specificity versus flexibility in the draft proposed guidance overall in other sectors.
Well, that was one of the hangups that I had with the amendment, was the lack of specificity. And there was no direct mention of any consequences to individual irrigators if they weren't following the guidelines.
Yeah, Jason or Tim, would you like to speak to that about how right now the draft proposed guidance is focused on termination of the agreement overall. Is there a way to kind of pick out if individual parties to an agreement are not abiding by the terms of the agreement? Is there a way to remove them or target them rather than maybe canceling the agreement altogether, finding it not to be yeah, go ahead. You get the flavor of what I'm asking, Jason, Tim.
Sure. There are ways to remove individuals from the voluntary agreement, as you'll see toward the bottom of the guidance document there. And that is one way to get it done. The other, really only other way that I'm aware of that we have any authority is to just terminate the agreement. And in that case, I suppose the remainder of a group that is following the guidelines laid out in the agreement could develop a similar agreement minus any folks that they no longer wanted to include. And so I think that's where our authority would lie on the voluntary agreements.
Okay.
Tim, I eagle-eyed you coming off of mute. Did you want to add anything else?
Well, all I was going to add is I don't know if this is possible or legal or whatnot. I'm not an attorney, but perhaps the voluntary agreement could contain some sort of penalty or something for users who fail to follow it. But again, I agree with Jason. I don't think the department has the authority to read a voluntary agreement and then enforce conditions within a voluntary agreement that aren't specifically authorized by statute and rule for the department to regulate. So I don't think we could go out and assess penalties on somebody for over pumping in a voluntary agreement based on voluntary agreement language. I think that would be untenable for the department to manage. So I guess users within a voluntary agreement would have to abide by the contract, and there would have to be some sort of contract language that handles that. And that's how I would probably recommend they deal with that non-compliance. Otherwise, I agree with Jason. It's broad termination is about the only thing that the department would have to recommend to the commission due to non-compliance.
Got it. Thank you both. Appreciate the feedback. Harmony, I do want to say I see your hand. I want to retain this time on the agenda for committee discussion right now, but I definitely do want to hear from you. So how about this as a point of process? I'd like the committee discussion to continue with committee members only for this agenda item, but if we have time near the end of the hour, near the top of the hour here, the end of our call, we'll see if there are any other comments from public commenters to provide additional context or feedback for the committee's information. Does that sound okay with everybody? Certainly am sensitive. I do want to make sure when we're talking about voluntary agreements, I want this committee to be responsive to public feedback. It seems very straightforward, but I also want to make sure that we're holding time on the agenda for committee member discussion. But yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. Comments on and context on non-compliance. Ken Bentz, we haven't heard from you. This is your stomping grounds. This is your neck of the woods. Do you have any thoughts about this guidance that we have in front of us?
I guess, yeah, a couple of questions, Zach. One, are we, as a committee, are we discussing some edits to this particular memo?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. So process standpoint, what are we talking about here? The committee today, we are not acting in our role of providing formal recommendations to the commission today. We may choose to do that at a future meeting if it makes sense for us to do so. What we are doing today, this discussion, is about providing our feedback to the department. So not the commission, but the department staff who have pulled together this draft proposed guidance. So in short, Ken, yes, feel free to provide feedback on specific parts or edits that you think are merited. I'd like to do it in a dialogue context. So, if there's something that you think other committee members should chime in on, would love to hear that too. Does that make sense?
Somewhat. I guess there's a couple things. One, I think we need to be aware that the memo is going to go forward as guidance. The problem with that is oftentimes what starts out as kind of something guidance and kind of just maybe a draft. It somehow over time morphs into policy and direction. So since this draft is going to be kind of the foundation of the state's approach to voluntary agreements, I think we might be getting ahead of ourselves as to what we're going to put before the commission, or what is going to be put before the commission. If this is going to be a voluntary work on as the foundation for a voluntary agreement, I think that we need to spend, we as a GWAC, as well as all the rest of us, may need to back up and work through this, specifically this particular memo and this guidance, using a lot more public input, because this has not been before specifically this item been before the community, and all of us together trying to sit down, since we're going to be the ones involved in the agreements. I think there's an awful lot more discussion and work that needs to be done locally before any of this goes in front of the commission. That would be my view.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate that. That's aligned with what we heard from some public commenters as well. Jason, in your presentation, I saw that the department was going to have staff engaging with the community in November. Is that right? Can you talk a little bit more about what the intent of that? Can you remind us what the intent of that is and what that looks like?
My understanding, Zach, well, so let me back up. I've been tentatively invited to a listening session in November, sort of the late part of November, where we've been invited to come out and talk to folks. I don't know the context of that discussion. You know, we haven't been asked to prepare anything other than provide some technical, you know, assistance ahead of time and some data, which we will get to folks as much as we have capacity to do so. And then, you know, my understanding is it was just more of a coming out and doing more of a listening session than, you know, where folks had the opportunity to talk to us about what they are proposing or starting to think along the lines of voluntary agreements. And, you know, we are there to listen, answer any questions that folks might have. And I don't think, you know, they're expecting much more than that from what my understanding.
Got it. Thanks, Jason. That's helpful context. So that sounds a little different from what Ken is thinking with active engagement about having, you know, directly soliciting community feedback on the guidance itself. So Ken, what do you think? I'm assuming that the listening session that Jason's referring to is not exactly what you had in mind, but what do you have in mind?
Well, here's somewhat of an analogy. Is that we have a voluntary agreement discussion going on between everyone with the department. The memo as written is basically the guidance says we're going to do a voluntary agreement. We want everybody to be involved, but here's the box. And by the way, whatever your voluntary agreement that you guys come up with has to fit in this box. I think that we need to maybe step back and reconsider how the box is designed, because it's pretty important. If it's not designed correctly, none of the voluntary agreements are going to fit in it. No one is going to want to try to fit in it. And I think that throughout the state, as well as our basin, I think these voluntary agreements are the way to address groundwater issues in the state. And so I think we need to be very, very careful in how we design the first set of those. And so I think that that's going to require a lot of input. And I think we want to make sure we do not restrict that, the directions that we can go with it too soon in the process. That would be that. So how that happens, you know, I don't think we want to spend another 5 or 6 years pushing it and shoving it around, but I think we do want to maybe involve all of us that have been involved in this prior to this time in specifically volunteer agreements as a specific topic, and how we would, I mean, we've discussed it, but we've not actually just sat down and concentrated on it. So what that looks like, and I realize that, and there's a lots of folks that are ready to move forward doing just that right now. So I think that that's how we should try to approach it. Sorry, got a little long-winded, but.
Oh, if you think that's long-winded, you haven't been paying attention to me talking. But yeah, no, thanks, Ken. I appreciate that. Definitely think it's important to make sure that the guidance doesn't unintentionally box out potential voluntary agreements that are currently being developed I share your concern about the precedent setting for voluntary agreements. If we have this current guidance for the Harney Basin specifically, and then there's rulemaking, as we heard earlier, for developing rules about voluntary agreements for the rest of the state, is there a risk of constraining voluntary agreements too much based on this precedent in the Harney Basin? I'm curious about that too. Wonder if WRD staff have any comments or concerns about that as well, or if you guys want to address that at all. If there's a voluntary agreement guidance that's specific to the Harney Basin, and then the statewide voluntary agreement rules that are later developed are different, is that a concern? Is that a problem?
What we've discussed in the past on that, Zach, internally, and I think we've shared this with other folks externally as well, is that, it's quite possible we would do a carve out for the Harney Basin if we have something established for the Harney that is working. Then we would likely be able to incorporate that into any future rulemaking.
Okay, got it. So yeah, so in some ways, if there's a carve out, then the precedents being set in the Harney Basin may not affect voluntary agreements across the rest of the state. But the future rest of the state rulemaking can incorporate lessons learned from the Harney Basin voluntary agreements about things that are working or things that aren't working as well. Is that the right way to interpret that?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Tim?
I'd say also, the Harney Basin is very different from a lot of other basins in the state. And the solutions that are possible in the Harney Basin are also very different than what may be possible in other portions of the state. And so trying to write one size fits all voluntary agreement guidance is going to be a challenge and take a lot of effort. And so hence why we dialed this in and focused this on the Harney Basin specifically. So
Understood. I think that makes sense. I understand the rationale for why this set of guidance is Harney specific. I'm curious about process. We're hearing from Ken, we heard from public commenters that there's a desire to have more opportunities for public feedback and engagement about the guidance itself. I understand that there are time sensitivities that Ken Beerley mentioned, where the voluntary agreements are kind of tightly constrained by rulemaking discussions. But with this guidance in particular, how flexible can it be over time? Once this guidance is sent to the commission, and if the department solicits additional feedback, do you still have the ability to make adjustments to the guidance? And then resubmit a revised draft to the commission? Or is it pretty set in stone once you present the guidance to the commission?
Zach, I don't think that it's set in stone. It's certainly changeable in the future as we learn more, as it has been developed over the last year or so. We have presented it to the commission in earlier forms, and it has changed since then, most recently just last week. So, I think that can continue. And, I think, like I said, we are learning as we go here with voluntary agreements. As others have mentioned, this is new for the state. And, we are learning how they're trying to put together something that will work for folks. What this guidance does is just really just present what the department feels is necessary to be included, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is what's required to be included. It can change as we learn and move into the future here.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, good reminder that this is quickly evolving. On that note, one thing I wanted to mention, especially for members of the public who are viewing this or attending this meeting, We're virtual, so Justin and Jason can't kick me under the table for saying this, but I think given this context that this is a continually evolving discussion, I do suggest that members of the public consider providing additional written feedback before I said Linda and Justin, and then Linda just put Justin's email in chat. So I think it's just maybe Justin. Provide written feedback to Justin or Jason or members of the department to continue to have your voice heard as the department thinks through what this guidance looks like. I've already said it, but before we leave that point, Justin, Jason, do you have any concerns about that invitation for additional feedback?
I don't have any concerns about that, Zach. I think that's fine.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say I don't have any concerns right now, and I'm gonna reserve the right to reverse that depending on what my inbox looks like tomorrow morning. I have been forwarding. I've gotten 2 pieces of written feedback, and I have forwarded that to both the GWAC members and the department staff that have been working on drafting the guidance. So anything sent to me will get distributed that way. Mhm. I guess if I may, I'm gonna risk uh, attempting to help the discussion a little bit. So I think going to Ken's comments, I totally understand his first comment of, hey, this is a draft guidance right now, and that if that's what we have and we need to start with something moving forward, that, you know, that's the default of what we pick up. I think that's very real. My understanding is that the reason we drafted this guidance in the first place was because we were being asked, how is the department going to view voluntary agreement proposals? And I do want to say that, like, we've heard a lot in the public comment about this as restrictive and doesn't allow enough opportunity for new thinking, right? Or different thinking. I want to say that we put this guidance together, I think, to say, hey, if a voluntary agreement is submitted that meets these admittedly pretty restrictive criteria, I think that we can say, if it meets this guidance, the department will recommend the commission adopt it. That's not constraining the guidance or constraining new ideas or different ideas. I think that a guidance can be proposed that has any number of things in it, and we'll give it fair hearing with the commission. We might not, like right now, what we've said in the guidance is we believe that the commission should set the success criteria, and the guidance, the voluntary agreement, should describe some way to get there other than a strict prior appropriation. That's, I think, how I would summarize this. But that's just us responding to how are you thinking about a VA with how we're thinking about it. It's not, I don't want to say that it boxes in. I think that it is telegraphing where the department's currently at with recommending a VA be agreed to or not. That doesn't mean that's what the commission needs to do. So if I've misspoken, I'd ask Jason, Tim, Ivan to jump on, but I hope that clarifies kind of the purpose of the document and where it is. So.
Thank you, Justin. So if the potential future voluntary agreements meet the terms of this guidance, you're signaling that the department will likely provide a recommendation. But if the proposed potential future voluntary agreements do not meet this guidance, the guidance is not mandating a recommendation against the voluntary agreement. So you're saying, like, this is what you'd like to see, but you're open to other possibilities as well.
Yep.
Ken, other committee members, how does that sit with you?
Sounds appropriate.
And I guess if GWAC thinks that the guidance, if you want to have discussion, tell us, as you've described, Zach, describe for the department what GWAC thinks is appropriate for the guidance. Happy to hear that and take that into account, and we'll discuss it and might see it in the next draft. So
Great. I appreciate that invitation. Well, I want to continue to make room. Appreciate that we've heard from Robin, we've heard from Dick, we've heard from Ken, other committee members. And Stephen, you spoke up about the uncertainty bands. Appreciate that. Other committee members stayed mostly silent, which is perfectly fine. You're not required to talk, but I'm curious if other folks have thoughts, suggestions, or questions about the current direction of this conversation.
I just have one quick clarifying question. I'm sorry, Tim and Jason, that I'm not up to speed on all of the rules, but in that paragraph I was asking about, they're looking at groundwater level change from 2028. Is that going to be the benchmark instead of everything I remember reading about was 2018? So I was just curious, where are we starting when we're looking at groundwater level declines?
Yeah, so for the purpose of the trajectories, that path to stability, the baseline that is proposed is 2028.
Okay.
And then we'll be tracking the change in water levels from 2028 in wells, taking the median of that group of wells within the sub area, and that's what we map against the trajectory.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
I'm trying as hard as I can to stay quiet and to shut up more, make room for other people to talk. But I'm struck by a little bit of the tension between hearing a lot that we need more time to discuss, and then not really hearing much, specific details that this committee would like to discuss. And I think, I understand that that's partly because the requests for more time are mainly by affected community members who may be party to a voluntary agreement. But I really do, I heard loud and clear during our last committee meeting, Groundwater Advisory Committee meeting, that the committee members wanted to talk this through. So anyway, think about it. I see Ivan has his hand up. Ivan, please go ahead. What's on your mind?
Zach, thank you, and members of the committee, thanks for your time. This is a pretty involved topic to get into, so I appreciate y'all taking time out of your busy schedules and the good public comment today. I guess I'll touch a little bit just for context for the committee and their consideration, sort of next steps as we see them and the time frame around that. If the Water Resources Commission adopts the proposed rules in December, our next step, those rules in and of themselves don't require any mandatory curtailments of groundwater use in the basin there. So there are many different projects, some of them relatively extensive, that the agency will need to go through to move this process along. We probably will take most of 2026 to do a couple of things. One would be beginning to work with groundwater users on the serious water management problem area. So that's working towards metering of groundwater use by 2028 and the reporting of those water use numbers over time. We have a great cost share program that can assist with that, and no time like the present to take advantage of that and get some meters installed. we have to go through an allotment process. So the technical team and field team are going to have to look at actual groundwater use to come up with a number for a starting point for future reductions. And that's going to take a significant amount of work. And then the team also has to go through the preparation process to begin preparing for a contested case in front of an administrative law judge at the Office of Administrative Hearings. And that's the formal process where the department and all the groundwater users get to bring their facts to the table and have a discussion about how the agency intends to move towards the mandatory reductions in groundwater use as would be outlined in the rules if they're adopted. Our best estimate is that that contested case itself is going to take 2 years. So that's going to tick off 2027 and a good chunk of 2028. Once the contested case process is done, we need to wait for the administrative law judge to issue a preliminary order. And that would be followed by the agency issuing a final order on the process. And so from rule adoption, we're probably a good 3 years out before that final order gets issued by the agency. And at that point in time, assuming there's no legal challenges to that final order, the department would begin and have the ability to implement the mandatory reductions, again, as laid out by the proposed rules there. If any person challenges that final order, then we're off to the Court of Appeals. And so that is likely to be at least a 2-year process there. And depending on the outcome of that, if it's appealed to the Supreme Court, up to another 2 years. So we're somewhere, our best estimate, between 7 and 8 years, if that final order is legally challenged, before we're able to actually effectuate any mandatory reductions in groundwater use. So there's a lot of discussion going around about the rules and the voluntary agreement documentation there and guidance and a sense of urgency. And I think, just again for context, this is really a relatively slow moving process with many additional steps ahead of the agency and the groundwater users before we get to the mandatory curtailment and reduction phase. So there's really a lot of opportunity for continued discussions around the voluntary agreement guidance document. Jason emphasized early on in his discussion that this is an interim document. It's subject to change. We're going to see great ideas brought to us by groundwater users or others in the community, and we'll want to make sure that we can incorporate those into the document or into voluntary agreements. We just cannot foresee all the potential ideas and solutions that lie before us in the near term and in the long term out there. And so we intend for the document to be a living document, subject to change, future discussions in front of this committee or others out there, and with guidance from the Water Resources Commission there as well. So I hope that helps just set the context, and appreciate everybody's time and thoughtfulness that goes into these decisions.
Yeah, right back at you. Thanks for your time to join us today, Ivan. That is helpful context. I'm here. It's a stark contrast to what we heard earlier, which was that sense of urgency you referred to have this, to have voluntary agreement guidance and voluntary agreements, kind of being considered within the next month or two. It sounds like there's many years possibly of opportunities to refine this guidance and to develop voluntary agreements. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. The flip of that is that I also want people to appreciate time and timing. The sooner reductions in groundwater use begin through whatever means, the better off for the long-term result to the groundwater resource itself. Our goal is stabilization of groundwater levels, hopefully at the highest levels possible to minimize the negative impacts to the domestic wells, groundwater discharge to surface water, spring complexes, groundwater dependent ecosystems, all of those things there that result from groundwater level declines there. So, I'm hopeful that folks really are taking this issue seriously and are anxiously moving towards voluntary reductions on all of their operations. With or without any voluntary agreement, that's something that's going to help the long-term management of the resource in the basin there.
Well said. Committee members, any questions for Ivan based on that additional context? See a couple of head shakes. Well, I'm interested then. I think it sounds like we may have additional time for this committee to engage with community members who may be bringing forward potential proposed voluntary agreements. It sounds like this committee may have more time to engage with the department on future iterations of this guidance document, which I see as overall a good thing, despite, or not despite, but in the context of what Ivan said, yeah, having action sooner rather than later is going to be beneficial for potential voluntary agreements that want to reduce potential future curtailment. I think from my perspective, one thing I'm continued to be interested about is how this Groundwater Advisory Committee interacts with future potential voluntary agreements themselves. During our last meeting in September, we raised the idea of this committee having a more clear role in evaluating potential voluntary agreements. I'm curious, I don't see that clear role in the current guidance draft, which is fine, but I'm just curious if department staff have had more time to think about how the GWAC intersects with this process and how the GWAC can help the department in our advisory capacity.
Yeah, Zach, I think, excuse me, I think I mentioned this briefly during the presentation that I believe it's our intention to bring any proposal before the GWAC committee as well. We will work through some processing steps for when we do receive voluntary agreements, and I expect those to include GWAC as part of the review process for any voluntary agreement.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I heard you earlier. It's not in the document itself, which is fine. I understand the intent. Robin, go ahead.
I guess with Ivan's time frame there, just wondering if there's a reason to add some more language, excuse me, around the approval of these voluntary agreements that is not tied to the rules, because the rules may not be in effect for such a long time. And I recognize that it is just guidance on approving these voluntary agreements, but in the absence of these specific metrics that are going to be included in the rules, is there a way that these voluntary agreements can be approved or denied based on something else? I guess, yeah, that's my question.
Robin, I can go ahead and take that if it's okay with the team. I think, again, the work that we've spent time with the Water Resources Commission working on is to get a sense from them as to what success looks like. And that really gets down to kind of this definition of groundwater level stability and at what level or at what time frame does that occur. And so we continue to work with the commission on that. But once those constraints, if you will, or goals, depending on how you want to look at it, are sort of embraced by the commission, they would be memorialized in the rules adopted by the commission. And again, if those rules themselves are subject to challenge or the contested case process gets bogged down, those goals are still there for the long-term water management of this particular basin. And so I don't know that it would be helpful to adopt voluntary agreements and that the commission would be willing to approve if they clearly wouldn't meet the goals of the commission itself there. So again, the rules may very well get adopted by the Water Resources Commission here in December. The rules themselves can get challenged. I didn't mention that, which would ensue other delays on top of the time frame that I mentioned there. But the rules may be valid and in effect while the contested case process is going on. And it's really the contested case, the order that comes out of the contested case and any legal challenges, if any, to that order, which will tie things up at Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. So.
Thank you for clarifying.
You bet.
Well, we've got some time left. I'm curious if, we heard some very specific feedback from public commenters earlier. Curious if committee members have any thoughts, just starting from the top of my notes. We heard that there were concerns about the guidance that says the commission can delegate authority to the department. Committee members, do you have feedback, concerns, comments about that authority in the guidance document?
I think the commission should retain their authority and not hand it over to the department.
Tell me a little bit more about that, Ken.
Well, I mean, that's their role is to oversee and direct the department. Why would they relinquish that in this case? They should retain it.
Other thoughts?
I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like you would need to change the statutes maybe if there was going to be a different authority for that, but
Okay, yeah, possibly. I'll add my personal perspective. I've been trying to mostly wear the hat of chair and like facilitator for this conversation. I'm also kind of a stakeholder in this space as well. But to me, the commission has to eventually be the one to approve or not approve a voluntary agreement at the end of the day. My understanding is that the authority being delegated here is just to act as commission staff to make a recommendation. It's not delegating authority for the department itself to approve or deny a voluntary agreement. Is that correct? I'm also not a lawyer, Robin, you can probably tell. But what is actually being delegated here and why does it matter?
Zach, Ivan again. I don't believe anything is being delegated. I think the purpose of that in the guidance document was to share with folks transparently that the commission does have the ability to delegate the approval or denial of voluntary agreements to the department, as they have delegated many of their other duties to the department over the decades.
Got it. Thanks, Ivan. So you're saying that actually the commission can simply say like, hey, department staff, Director Gall, you choose whether this voluntary agreement is approved or denied. Is that right?
They can delegate that authority to the department. That's correct.
Is that in statute or is that being proposed as a policy here in this guidance?
There is a statute that gives the commission relatively broad authority to delegate many of their duties to the department or the director.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. Continue to be curious about that as a point of contention, that of all parts of this guidance that felt not super hard hitting to me. But Ken, like, can you just, I don't want to keep on putting you on the spot, Ken. I don't mean to. I'm just curious if you would elaborate a little bit. What are your concerns with the commission delegating its authority?
Well, I think that I think it's probably something that the commission is actually designed for, to make this decision. As everything changes, I mean, people change, and the landscape will change, the players change. So I think that when these volunteer agreements come forward, I just think it's too big of an issue to not have it come before the commission. Because it changes how Oregon water law works, and so I just think it's too sensitive an item to not have it reviewed by and approved or disapproved by the commission.
Got it. That's helpful. Really, thanks for elaborating a little bit. Yeah, our committee and our advice to the department on this guidance, we're not changing statute here. But we can suggest or recommend changes to what's in the guidance document itself. And so, I guess for consideration, it is a choice the department is making to remind the commission about this authority, and to remind the commission about this authority in this document. I guess it's open for debate. Like here, Ken, you're saying you don't agree with including this in the draft guidance document, even if it is a statute.
Actually, I did that's no, it can remain in the draft guidance document. I'm just going to recommend as a GWAC member that the commission not do that, even though it's within their right to do so.
Got it. Okay. In that case, from a process standpoint, I believe that as the GWAC considers potential future advice to the commission based on voluntary agreements that are brought before us, I believe that can be part of the GWAC's recommendation. Our role is to provide recommendations or suggestions or advice to the commission. I believe, Ken, that part of our advice can be that the commission, the current commission, discuss and approve or not approve the voluntary agreements rather than delegating it. And the commission can choose whether or not to take our advice, right? But that feels like the right part of the process to engage in.
I agree.
Okay. Okay, got it. Committee members, we're nearing the end of this. We're nearing the top of the hour. I did want to retain a little bit of time. Harmony Barite, public commenter, had requested, had offered additional context. I wanted to save a couple of minutes for that at the end of this conversation. But committee members, are there other points that you'd like to discuss in the last 5 minutes of this call? I see some head shakes. Justin Iverson, you look thoughtful. What are you thinking about?
I'm sorry, I'm still thinking about process and Ken's comment about a potential committee recommendation. I'm trying to think forward to when the appropriate time to make that is. And hearing what you had said earlier, Zach, and framing up the meeting. So my thoughtfulness was, is that a December thing or not? So I'll get back to the committee on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I suspect committee that especially as Jason mentioned during his presentation, especially if the GWAC is going to be reviewing and providing feedback and advice to the commission about potential future voluntary agreements, I think we will have many more of these conversations. I think given that context, I would like to consider ways for this committee to hear from potential parties to future voluntary agreements. I'd like to think about ways for this committee to engage more with the Harney Basin community. I don't have answers right now about what that looks like from a process standpoint. If you committee members have suggestions, please let me know or let Justin know. Maybe Justin, you and I can scheme a little bit between meetings of the GWAC and try to cook up what that looks like in the future. But I do think that this is voluntary agreements specific to the Harney Basin. This committee will be hearing more about them and having a more concrete set of examples to look at and to discuss in the near future. Voluntary agreements in general across the state. I agree with something that Ken said earlier. Ken mentioned that VAs might be an important tool across Oregon. I think this committee will be an important conduit for thinking through what the implications of future voluntary agreements are, what they look like in different geographies. So I would just encourage all of us, including myself, to keep on reviewing the written comments we've received, keep on considering the public comments, the verbal public comments we heard today and back in September, and think through what the committee's role and the advice we can provide, what that looks like functionally for the department and for the commission. But with that said, Harmony, are you still around and are you still willing to chime in and provide a little clarification on some of those points you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. If it's appropriate, I can also, given the limited time, I can also send some things in writing if you're able to accept and distribute those.
Please, I encourage you to also submit comments or clarifications in writing. We are continuing to accept written comment. Would be curious to see what you and others have to say. We do have a minute, Harmony, so if you have anything in particular you want to add at the end of the meeting, you have time to do so.
Yeah, I think for the committee members, so I've been working on these issues in the Harney Basin for 10 years, and it's just within the last 6 months that I've really begun to interface with a significant amount of groundwater users. So right now I'm trying to organize and coordinate 40 individuals, all with distinct operations, all with distinct personalities, all with different obligations. And I just want to emphasize the challenge of that, of coordinating 40 people who are actually experiencing a lot of stress around this. And we're doing the best we can to organize them. I do have thoughts on process and how best to engage them if you're interested. I think it's important to note, I would really encourage the committee to get to know the Harney Basin and the different areas in the Harney Basin. So the areas where folks are actively working on voluntary agreements, they are different from probably the areas that you've heard the most about. So most folks that I've worked with, the problems in the Weaver Springs and Northeast Crane area have been well known for decades. People have understood and agree that reductions are necessary there, and that those are most likely to occur with a strong kind of regulatory approach. In the parts of the basin where I am working, most of these folks were under the expectation until April of this year that no regulation would be occurring in their part of the basin. And so they were taken by surprise. And I think there's an opportunity here because we actually have people talking now. We have people trying to understand and converse about the conditions. For the first time, we are having conversations amongst groundwater users. That's a great thing. We are having conversations between groundwater users and folks who manage springs. These conversations have not occurred before. There is mutual concern for managing the resource for all beneficial uses. I would also mention that in the areas where voluntary agreements are being developed, most of these folks are also the domestic well users. They are the farmers and the domestic well users. We will be doing outreach to all domestic well owners with the hopes of understanding their concerns and addressing those as well. At this point, no domestic wells, to my knowledge and to the knowledge of the folks that I've been talking to in the Silver Creek area, have been impacted. And in the Blitzen area, I think it's one. And so, we've got the modeled projections of impacts, we have the actual impacts. And I really think it's important for us to understand
what is actually occurring in the parts of the basin where voluntary agreements are likely to come forward. What are we managing for? And how are we really considering and accounting for those who are responsible for stewarding the resource and who are likely to be impacted by any decisions coming forward? So I truly hope that we can spend some time getting this committee up to speed on, the areas where these agreements would be coming forward and hearing from the folks on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harmony. I look forward to working with you on that and scheming with Justin on ways to make that happen. Thank you again to all of the public commenters. Really appreciated the feedback you all had. Really appreciated you guys taking time out of your days to join this committee as we discuss the voluntary agreements. Justin, you and I should put our heads together about our next meeting. And as a reminder, the next meeting of the Groundwater Advisory Committee is December 9th, Tuesday, the Tuesday before the next Water Resources Commission meeting. So I will look forward to seeing you all again there. Thank you. And again, if you have written feedback for this committee to consider, please, I do strongly recommend you submit it to us. We are reviewing, we are reading that feedback. It matters. With that, thank you, committee members. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate all of your time. And thank you, Director Gall, for joining us on this meeting. Talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.